The history of South Africa's civil society activism goes back many years, and notably the opposition and resistance to the apartheid regime, the Sharpville massacre in 1960, the 1956 Women's March, and of course the June 16, 1976 Soweto uprisings. And as we continue to reflect on 30 years of our country's democracy, this morning we take a look at how civil society organizations and activists continue to play a pivotal role in shaping the country since the 1994 democratic elections. Now, guided by the country's constitution, their advocacy has resulted in many milestones, including the right to healthcare, access to water, equal education, and of course, the fight against gender-based violence. To talk to us more about the transformation of social justice movements in the 30 years of our country's democracy, we're joined virtually now by social justice activist Axolile Notywala. Axolile, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you, and good morning to you and the viewers.
Now, as a social justice activist, how would you describe the role of civil society today, looking back from the role that was played during the apartheid years to post-1994 democratic South Africa?
Well, thank you for that. I think now I would say we are looking at what I would call a third phase of civil society, which is for the next 30 years. And that remains very important because the country still remains in crisis on many issues. And I mean, there was that just recently an article published on News 24 about the state of mental health that is caused by poverty, unemployment, violence, and many other things. And so the next 30 years are going to be important. But the past 30 years have also been very important for civil society. And civil society has played a very important role in keeping our democracy intact. But also that work has not happened alone. I think we also have to give props because within civil society, we've been able to work particularly with the media and also through the judiciary. And so the three have been able to help in making sure that we keep those that are in power accountable, and we keep them to make sure that they continue to deliver on many failed promises.
So 30 years since our country's first democratic elections, what would you say, Axolile, are your views on the country in terms of the fight for human rights, inalienable human rights? We know they are enshrined in our constitution, but how are we faring?
We're failing in many ways. We have children that die on a regular basis because they don't have safe spaces. We have the highest rate, some of the highest rate of rape and murder in the country, sexual violence, and these are due to the failures of the state. And we also know that we are one of the countries where people live in poverty, and in cases that we've seen reported again in the media in the Eastern Cape, where mothers go to the extent of taking their lives and the lives of their children as a result of poverty. And a lot of times it has been civil society. And when we talk about civil society, I think it's also important to think of the small, sometimes not very seen, community-based organizations that keep our people fed, that have community kitchens, and that keep our children in safe spaces. But in terms of the country in general, when it comes to human rights, I think those in power have failed us quite a lot. And a lot of that blame has to be put, I think, on the African National Congress, because I think there was a demobilization in 1994 of some of civil society. And up until the late 1998, when the Treatment Action Campaign was formed, then civil society started to be revived. But we need to do more now because we are a country in crisis.
So in terms of that, and looking at the past 30 years, how would you say civil society in South Africa has actually shaped us in terms of justice and social justice campaigns in the main?
I think, I mean, if we look at our democracy as a whole, I think democracy, I look at it as electoral democracy and participatory democracy. And electoral democracy is when we have to vote and is when we have to choose who has to lead us. But in terms of participatory democracy, and that's where civil society has played quite an important role when it comes to popular and political education for people to understand and their own rights. Civil society has played that role. But again, and I mentioned litigation, and when it comes to the judiciary, where when we see these systemic failures and the structural failures, we are able to take the government to court. And there's many important landmark cases as a result. One is the treatment action campaign around HIV and AIDS and treatment for that. I can talk about the recent not so long ago, my vote counts on party funding. I can talk about the right to protest, the Social Justice Coalition, equal education, in making sure that our schools have minimum norms and standards. But that also needs more work because the cases alone aren't getting us where we want to be. Once there is a case and once there is a judgment, there needs to be more pressure from civil society, from communities in general, to make sure that there is implementation. So far, we've seen a lot of failures in making sure that there is implementation. We still talk about the Grootboom case, where Grootboom herself died without a house, while the Constitutional Court gave a judgment that says everyone deserves a house. And she never got to see a house because of the failures of the state and implementation on those that we put to power.
You know, Axolile, the president yesterday during the keynote address that he delivered for Reconciliation Day, I was making some notes as he was speaking, and one of the things that he said was, you know, our task is to complete the work of the TRC, and then went on to say, we must end inequality. Now, South Africa has not realized equality. If anything, we seem to be becoming more unequal as a society. So what's your stance on that in terms of shifts from being pro-poor? Do you think we have moved, and is government doing enough to close the divide between the haves and the have-nots?
No, not at all. I think the inequality gap is growing. And I think that the first thing that we have to do is, in order for us to get to equality, we have to stop thinking about inequality alone. We have to think about equity, because we are not starting from the same. And so if we are to make sure that we deliver for those that we have not delivered for, it means that we have to put way more resources and we have to think about equity. And that if we think about land, for example, and if we think about housing, that means there is a lot more in terms of our population that doesn't have those resources. And so we have to move resources to those areas. Because currently, the state at which we are going, we are going to see more and more people becoming unhappy. We are known as a country that protests a lot. And the responses to those protests, also in terms of how the state responds, it becomes very violent. We know of Marikana, we know of many other cases where civil society and social justice activists and community members have been killed because of many of these challenges. So we are very, very far in terms of realizing equality. We have to make sure that we think about equity.
Well, Axolile, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for that engagement and really sobering. Axolile Notywala is a social justice activist reflecting on 30 years of our country's civil society movements in the fight for social justice and human rights in South Africa. And hope, you know, that was food for thought for you as well.